Ethics is about decision-making. I think in a business context, when people hear the word ethics, they equate it with compliance and they think it's going to be, here are the rules to follow. But in philosophy, ethics has more to do with the way people reason about decisions. A dilemma is where the right answer is not obvious. A dilemma is choosing between two good things, but maybe they can't happen at the same time. And that's what creates the dilemma, is how do you pick which good thing to pursue?
So the essential question is, how might this be true? By correspondence, what other kind of evidence could I get to support it? Or by coherence, what other observations, interpretations would be consistent with it? And it's the pausing to ask, in effect, what might be true here?
People who want to project a false certainty, and I think it's better to be candid. We don't know than to pretend like we do know. I mean, just obviously practically, if you pretend you know something you don't and make a decision on it, that could sometimes lead to a catastrophic mistake.
I think it's a hallmark of what gives you authenticity. That ability to say, I'm uncertain, but we're going to go here. We're going to do this, even though we don't know. Truth is often elusive in some of these places. How do you tell among all the information, all the advice, all the data, what might actually be real and what's not real? Where do you start there?
Well, I guess I'll start with
there is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. All right, regardless where you're sitting in the world or the job you're doing, I'm going to bet that you're inundated with data. But I'm also going to tell you that there is never enough data to know if you're making a good decision or not. And the more senior you get, the harder it is to know if that decision was the right one, quote unquote, or not. It could take years before you know. Often the data is incomplete, it's unclear, it's not sure how to interpret it. There's a lot riding on it, so we get nervous about it. Well, what that typically means for us as human beings is we start looking for certainty when there really isn't certainty in the world. So what we want to talk about today is, how do you make good decisions? What do you need to be thinking about to get a better decision? A better decision when information may be conflicting, when advice is conflicting, when you're not sure if everything you're being told is accurate or not accurate. How do you begin to think through that in a reasoned and systematic way? So my guest today is Haywood Spangler. He's the founder and principal of Work and Think, and he's really about helping clients do complex decisions that have a realistic understanding of the uncertainty that exists. He's got a fairly well-known assessment called the Spangler Ethical Reasoning Assessment. We'll talk about that later. But more importantly, the book that we're talking about is Reasoning for Business, the Inquirer's Guide to Decision Making. So Haywood, welcome to the conversation.
Great. So happy to be here today. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Delighted to have you here. You know, there are a lot of people who talk about decision making, and I know a lot of people in the decision makers. This is one of the more thought through, detailed, analytical pieces of work that I've seen in quite a long time. So good for you. So we're going to have a little bit of a challenge of getting all of these together.
I appreciate it.
But let me start at the fun part, which is why. Why did you decide to study decisions? And more importantly, why did you do that with a degree in philosophy?
Well, I started really talking and studying ethics. So in philosophy, my field is ethics, and I started my career in academia teaching business ethics and biomedical ethics. So ethics is about decision-making. I think in a business context, when people hear the word ethics, they equate it with compliance, and they think it's going to be, here are the rules to follow. But in philosophy, ethics covers a wide array of topics and has more to do with the way people reason about decisions. And as I moved out of academia into trying to have applied philosophy for business, I started to talk about ethics as decision-making, because ethics is inherently decision-making. But the kinds of decisions I focused on and that I still work with people on are dilemmas. And a dilemma is necessarily where the right answer is not obvious. And when people hear dilemma, they might think of a dilemma is maybe choosing between the lesser of two evils, and it can be, but more often I find a dilemma is choosing between two good things, but maybe they can't happen at the same time. And that's what creates the dilemma is how do you pick which good thing to pursue? And that's really where philosophy comes in to help. So are there relevant duties you need to observe to other people? How do you balance the good of each individual versus the good of the group? When is a cost benefit analysis appropriate, but also when do you pay attention to relationships and building trust and fidelity over time? Those are all concepts in philosophy and philosophical ethics that I think really, when you understand them, they enhance your ability to make a complex decision or navigate a dilemma, or I call them, and this isn't original to me, but I call them gray areas when the right answer is not obvious.
Right. I like that. What's interesting, when we say ethics, we often think of right and wrong decisions, like this one's wrong and that one's right. But as you point out, so many of the complicated decisions, the one people wrestle with, are really gray. It is not clear what is right or what is wrong. There's an element of right in one or an element not so good in another. And how do you make those trade-offs between two competing alternatives, two competing sets of data, which is what you mean by dilemmas. So I get that. And I agree that philosophy is the only place that teaches us some of the skills there. All right. So let's start with this thing about truth. Truth is often elusive in some of these places. How do you tell among all the information, all the advice, all the data, what might actually be real and what's not real? Where do you start there?
Well, I guess I'll start with concepts in philosophy just to create a framework for my response. And that is, in philosophy, there are theories of truth. When I talk about that, I always want to be careful that it's not relativism. I feel like as soon as you use the word theory and then put the word truth next to it, people's first response is, what do you mean? And certainly with clients that I've worked with over the years, when I started to talk about different theories of truth, their first response was, how can it be a theory? It's black or white, or something's true or false. And theories of truth really is the idea that different domains or different subject matters, this may be a better word, have different standards of truth. So there absolutely is truth and falsehood, and there are things that we don't know enough about to determine truth or falsehood. But whether you're looking at results from a scientific study or a theory of history or results from maybe a political scientist, those are different subjects or different domains, and they really have different standards of truth. So as I worked with clients to get them to feel more comfortable and better equipped really to navigate all the data, all the public discourse, I start by sharing this idea of theories of truth and getting comfortable with the term and the concept truth pluralism. So again, it's not that everything's true. It's not cynicism. It's not saying nothing's true. But again, depending on the subject, there's a different standard of truth. And one standard is the correspondence theory of truth. And that for most people in my experience, that is what they think is the theory of truth. So if you make a statement, I'm looking out my window and I see green leaves and sunshine, then that should correspond to the reality that outside my window is sunshine and green leaves. And there are a lot of places where the correspondence theory of truth is relevant. So an example I use a lot is if you have a medical diagnosis, this is maybe not the best example, but some people in my family have had cancer. So if there's a scan and the doctor finds a spot, well, that scan corresponds to reality. There's a physical reality. There's a spot on your lung or a spot on some part of your body. So that's true by correspondence. But what a lot of people run into, especially in leadership positions, and certainly as we take in blogs and experts and news, we consume a lot of interpretation, and interpretation is not necessarily true by correspondence. So this is an example. I'm picking kind of a neutral example, but people might be familiar with the great person theory of history. And it's the idea that history has changed course due to certain dynamic individuals. Well, that's one interpretation of historical data. So if you said Napoleon changed the course of history, well, we know there was a person named Napoleon. That's true by correspondence. But how do you know he and just four other people changed the course of Western history? Well, that could be true by another theory called coherence. And what coherence means is if you're looking more at an interpretation, a theory that explains something, maybe it explains voter behavior, maybe it explains consumer behavior. If you're looking at a theory, you may not be able to prove that theory true by correspondence. There might be some actual state of affairs that that theory points to, but you could still say, is that theory internally coherent? Does it make sense, or is it self-contradictory? And then you can look more widely and say, does that theory align with other similar theories? So is it part of a broader framework that would help you make sense out of a situation, whether you're a history buff and you want to understand great changes in history, or whether you want to understand consumer behavior. So that's the basic in philosophy distinction I tried to share with clients and that I write about in the book. And most people do assume that the correspondence theory, that's what truth is. And in some cases, that's what truth is. But there are other situations where that correspondence theory is not really going to help you determine the truth if it's an interpretation of, again, let's just say voter behavior from a political scientist. So those are the two basic theories I share with people.
Okay, so let me see if I can put this in language I can actually digest and remember. It's the notion that there are different standards of truth. So in different places in our lives, we want different standards. So, for example, if I have a medical diagnosis, whatever it is, I'd like a certain degree of certainty that what we're doing is actually going to treat the symptoms that I have. So if I'm looking at a forecast, for example, I may have a very different view of what level of truth I'm willing to tolerate. So I accept that there are different approaches to these levels of truth. And then I look for two kinds of supporting evidence. One is correspondence, meaning I can test that in reality and see that, yes, indeed, the leaves are green. And coherent is it's consistent, in other words, with lots of other things that I may say, some things, other things that I may say. All right, so Haywood, let's take then a scenario that I hear an awful lot of times from senior leaders from the very top of the organization. And people will say, you have to know that when somebody is coming to talk to you, they're probably telling you 50% of the truth, meaning they're telling you their perspective about an event. I don't mean they're intentionally lying. I mean they have a perspective on an event. And you have to be looking for what's the other perspective? What's the other half of the story they're not telling me? How do you fit that in with your theories of truth? Is that coherence or something else?
I think it is very great example. I would say that is coherence, because when you're asking somebody, and you just use the word interpretation, you're asking somebody, what's your interpretation of the events? And there might be facts that you could show by correspondence, like something's late, or it didn't arrive, or it's still at the warehouse, just use simple examples. But to ask somebody's interpretation, why do you think this chain of events happened? Well, that's their interpretation. So they might refer to some facts, but they are giving you their theory, and you invited their theory. So I think that is a great example of where you would use coherence and being aware that you're going to have to gather some other theories and maybe some other concrete data that could be true by correspondence to test their theory. So if what their interpretation aligns with four other people you talk to, that's how you're starting to show that something is true by coherence, is their stories line up. And maybe another analogy, you have a great real world example, but another analogy, maybe the way detectives work. So for better or for worse, I like detective fiction and detective shows. And so as they're investigating, they do collect people's interpretation of an event, a crime, and they look for coherence. Like, are the stories similar, or are they wildly divergent? So I think that's a great illustration of where this would come up. And again, often in the interpretation, there will be facts you could check in the correspondence sense of, did certain things happen or not happen?
Okay. All right. Fair enough. All right, now I'm going to ask the kind of question of why. Like, why should I care about correspondence and coherence and theories of truth? How does it help me as a leader?
Well, I think it's going to help. And I know from my own experience of coaching executives, it's really going to make you a more savvy consumer of information and ultimately help you make sounder decisions. I think many people, whether it's an individual sharing a theory or a book you've read or a source, I will be honest, I've never seen anybody present what they're telling you as this is possibly true by coherence. People will present it to you as, here's the truth. And if you just take it at face value, well, you might be missing some key information. You might make a poor decision because you haven't looked broadly enough at all of the information. So I think, pardon the cliche, but in some ways it's a way of being forewarned, and forewarned is forearmed. Maybe, again, I hate to use cliches, but that's coming to mind right now, that when you're aware and you stop to ask, how could this be true? This theory somebody's sharing with me. And maybe I'll rephrase. I think that's the key question is you read something or somebody shares something with you verbally, ask yourself, in what way could this be true? And you might find that it couldn't be true by correspondence and it couldn't be true by coherence, which means that's not true or it's false. So I think it's a way of navigating information in a more savvy way because, most information we get is going to say this is the truth and it's true in that typical sense you're expecting by correspondence.
Right. Okay, so the essential question is, how might this be true? By correspondence, what other kind of evidence could I get to support it? Or by coherence, what other observations, interpretations would be consistent with it? And it's the pausing to ask, in effect, what might be true here or what might not be true. Now, how do you keep that from turning you into a cynic about human beings and things that everybody is telling you all the time?
Well, I think that's a great question. And it might depend on just what's behind the question. So are you expecting things to be true until they're proven false? Or are you expecting them to be false till proven true? And you might start with a more optimistic, if you ask, how could this be true? That's really an open-ended question. And you're equally open to finding the truth as you are to disproving it. And there are times when to assume something's false till proven true is really useful. But I think if that's constantly your MO, that does more likely lead to cynicism, which is generally everything you encounter, you don't believe till proven otherwise.
Right.
And that can also just be very tiring to constantly be in a state of doubt when you don't need to be. So maybe having just a neutral stance of, I really am agnostic. I'm asking, in what way could this be true? And I'm just as open to finding that it is true as I'm open to finding that it's false.
That it's false.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm going to take a sidestep for a minute, but you'll see where this is going. I have a longstanding habit of, my dissertation work is on oral traditions, not my dissertation work. My post-dissertation work is on oral traditions. And as we often know, when you play the rumor game, you say something and then you pass it down and pass it down and pass it down and pass it down, and it gets completely distorted by the time it comes back to the original. We've all played that game. So part of my question is, how does this thing become stable in the context of this human behavior? I'm not going to answer that question, but what it does do, it has put me in touch with all sorts of urban legends and rumors and stories that fly around on email or on the internet or whatever your favorite social media platform. And I have a pretty high track record, Haywood, of being able to spot the falsehood. And then it's easy once you say, that doesn't seem true. You go back in and look at it and, it's been circulating for the last 10 years. And yes, here are the variations on the theme. But the way I spot it is if you don't have the emotional reaction that the story is trying to get you to have, and you start to look, there's internally incoherent pieces of data. And that's the way I spot it. So is that the same as what you're saying also in terms of coherence theory?
Absolutely. That's a great example. And I think, you said two key things there that I agree with, and I'll amplify. One is being very aware of the emotional response. And so part of what you've just spoken about, and I try to highlight in the book that I've worked with my clients on, just to backtrack a bit, is why are you going to a particular piece of information? So if you go to a certain source, let's say on social media, I advise people to be aware. Social media has echo chamber qualities. You might go there for entertainment, but are you really going to go there for objective information? Just ask yourself that question first. And there are times, though, I think increasingly, I really appreciate your bringing up that example, where people are going to a news source, or they listen to a news source that they have perceived to be objective. And I even wrote an example about this in the book, a specific person, a specific client, and it really surprised her that this news source, they kind of had changed their approach over a few years, and increasingly they were telling stories to get people emotionally with some facts woven in. But they started to use the term, we use juicy narratives or something to that effect. So I think the first thing that you just mentioned is you need to be aware, when is a story designed to elicit an emotional response. And sometimes that's okay. You might want that. Like, I read murder mysteries. I guess I like a sense of suspense. But when you're looking for objective information, I think first being able to say, there is narrative here. which is designed to elicit emotion. So I'm going to be careful. I'm not going to have the emotional response. But the second part of your question is exactly right. Then you're able to actually look at the content and compare it over time and maybe see how a story's evolved and then say, this isn't internally coherent and it's not matching. So this narrative is not giving me the truth.
Yeah. All right. So I believe that our brains look to put together a story. They like to have a nice package that all fits together, and we fill in the gaps, even if they're not there in reality. I saw an AI image on some social media feed. Same problem. When you decide to just really look at it, you realize that the picture doesn't actually fit. You could spot the inconsistencies on that one. But we don't do that as our brain. Our brain just sort of says, oh my goodness, and off we go. So I think in some ways it's training your brain to stop and say, what's this response? Why is it generated? And what else might be happening here? I think it's an interesting question. Okay, so coherence, so the notion that there are different degrees of truth, different standards of truth is the right answer. Science versus, say, a business decision. Forecast versus an actual data point from an experiment, maybe is another one. That we look for where there's correspondence, that the facts of this correspond with something in reality, or coherence, that there are multiple sources telling me the same thing. Okay? Now, and we stop to recognize that and ask that question. Now, you also talk about pragmatism. Where's the role of pragmatism in all of this?
Well, as I talk about pragmatism, it's another theory of truth in philosophy, and there are different versions of it. So I just have to be honest. The philosopher that I credit with it is a personal hero, William James. So people might have read William James. If you read him at all, he's more famous for a book called Varieties of Religious Experience. But he wrote about pragmatism as a theory of truth. And this is where I have to be careful not to sound like a relativist. But James thought that we can talk about truth as immediately useful. And there are some answers that we're not going to answer. Pardon me, scratch that. There's some questions that we're not going to answer definitively, but we're going to come up with a theory that works well enough to help us solve certain problems. And that's what pragmatism is. So I think as I've shared it with different executives I've coached and talked about it in critical thinking classes, pragmatism really is recognizing, again, some things we can prove by correspondence and other things we can't prove by correspondence. And let's say there's an interpretation, and I'll go back to the simple example. Let's say that you want to agree with the great person theory of history, and you know it can't be proven by correspondence. That can be where pragmatism comes in. And I would say, what is accepting that theory doing for you? What problem is it helping you solve? And if it's helping you solve a problem, then it's true in a limited pragmatic sense. It might not actually be objectively true about history, but to help you answer a specific question or solve a problem, does it need to be objectively true about all of history? Probably not. If it helps you solve a specific problem, then it's true in that case. And again, to some people, I'm always a little self-conscious. That might sound a little bit like relativism, like, oh, everything's true, but it isn't. If a certain theory is not helping you solve a specific problem, then it's not true. But if it is helping you solve that specific problem, it's true in that case. So to me, the pragmatic theory of truth is the most useful because in some ways you don't have to get hung up in, is something true in the correspondence sense, or is it absolutely universally true? Maybe, maybe not. You don't need to answer that question. Just focus on the problem in front of you. Is this going to be a solution? Does this theory help you solve this problem? If the answer is yes, then that's true for this situation.
I think about this in terms of uncertainty, which is the next piece that I want to talk about at any rate. You don't know, you know that you're not going to know, but you develop a theory that helps you solve the immediate problem of what do we do next? And you work with that theory until it isn't working. And then you say, okay, so what do we need to know now? If you find more information then that helps you with coherence or correspondence. But it's that sense of, this thing helps us move forward, so let's go with it. Said we're going to talk about uncertainty, but I want to make one more comment. When I am working with clients, coaching them, particularly around relationships and difficult conversations, frequently we run into a problem with, well, this person is, and fill in the blank, often jealous or some variation on that theme. I find it really helpful to say that's one theory. Or one hypothesis. Because what it does when I say that is to say we can't objectively really totally know if that's true. It could be, but we don't know. And then it forces you to ask, are there other theories? And that, I just find that language really, really useful. And you're using it here in the same kind of context. Calling it theory, I think, is just helpful to keep it in perspective.
Absolutely. I think that's it's a really good insight about how to navigate relationships, and even just to use the idea of a pragmatic theory of truth. And I've been in those coaching sessions and somebody's attributing to the other person, well, they're just jealous or some motivation. And you're exactly right. You can't reach their mind. So they're jealous is a kind of theory. It's a hypothesis. And then, you might say, well, what evidence are you seeing behaviorally to tell you it's jealousy and not this other thing? And that's where also the pragmatic theory of truth can come in. What is it going to do for you? And how is it going to help you make this relationship better to say they're jealous? Is that actually going to help you navigate the relationship? Because if it isn't, then that's not a useful theory. And let's find one that's going to work
Great.
better.
That was an excellent example. I learned it. I loved it. I'm going to use it again.
Well, you
get
gave
credit
it to
for
me.
it.
You taught me. So thank you.
No, you called it pragmatism. I like that part. All right. So let's talk about this whole thing about uncertainty. So I've got these different different kinds of truth, different standards of truth. I've got at least 3 different theories of how we might go about thinking about truth. How does all of this help me deal with uncertainty? The fact that I just don't know and probably won't know.
Well, I think it can help you be more comfortable with uncertainty. And to go back, part of the way I get people to accept that there are different theories of truth is, again, this idea of truth pluralism. And that's kind of a psychological pivot people have to make, and understand that to be competent and to make good decisions does not mean you have to be absolutely right and know everything. So probably the ability, and I'd say more than probably, again, in my work with executives I coach, the ability to say, I have a pluralistic view of truth. There are different standards for different subjects. That goes along with an uncertainty tolerance, which is the ability to say, the fact that I don't have all the information, the fact that a decision we're going to make is provisional and may need to be revised, that does not mean I look incompetent or unprofessional or stupid. That's actually, to me, when a leader can acknowledge uncertainty, it's more a sign, I think, of self-confidence, that they're not, to backtrack a bit, often people, part of what I write about and I've observed is people who want to project a false certainty. And I think it's better to be candid. We don't know than to pretend like we do know. I mean, just obviously practically, if you pretend you know something you don't and make a decision on it, that could sometimes lead to a catastrophic mistake. But really, it requires self-confidence to be able to say, we don't have all the information, and that's okay. We're going to proceed based on what we do know, and we're going to be open to changing course in the future. So I think that uncertainty tolerance is the foundation for a lot of the philosophical material I use. And really, to develop uncertainty tolerances, even though my background's in philosophy, I would say that's more psychological work. And some of it is just reminding yourself that acknowledging uncertainty does not mean you're incompetent or even seeming incompetent or unsure or weak. It actually can be a sign of again, great self-confidence, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a hallmark of what gives you authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yes.
ability to say, I'm uncertain, but we're going to go here. We're going to do this, even though we don't know. One of my podcast guests, who's an entrepreneur, a very successful entrepreneur, said, one of the biggest mistakes he watches people make is they try to make a decision too soon, too big of a decision. And he says, what's the minimum decision we have to make at this point in time, and make that, then you get more information, more data, and then you make the next one. It's an interesting philosophy about decisions. But this notion that uncertainty and comfort with uncertainty is a psychological construct, we certainly see that in psychological profiles. When we do a personality profile, for example, you can find that some people are quite comfortable not knowing and taking the risk associated with that and discovering along the way. And other people want to make sure they've thought through every single possible contingency before they're prepared to make a decision. And so how do you think about those two different personalities? What would be your advice?
Some of it, and I do talk about uncertainty, and I've taught some seminars just on uncertainty tolerance. And part of what I ask people to think about, or maybe recognize, is that I think we have different uncertainty tolerances depending on what part of our life we're talking about. So for myself, I'm self-employed, and I always say when I'm talking about uncertainty, I apparently have an incredibly high tolerance for not knowing how much money I'm going to make every year, because I start out the year not knowing how much money I'm going to make. And I've been a consultant 15 years, and it doesn't keep me up at night. And some people would, and they even say to me, "You're not salaried. That's crazy." However, if I take a trip, I have to have literally every minute planned. I don't want one open. I mean, I might have like an hour blocked off as nap time, but otherwise I need to know exactly where I'm going. So I'm highly intolerant of uncertainty. I'm highly tolerant of uncertainty when it comes to my career, but I'm very intolerant of uncertainty when it comes to travel. So when people are intolerant of uncertainty in a professional setting, one technique, I guess you could call it kind of almost solution focused therapy technique, is the part of your life where you are very tolerant of uncertainty. What are you doing there? How do you make yourself, and let's flip it. Let's say it's a person who loves to be totally spontaneous on a trip. And my best friend is like that. He just does not speak Spanish and up and bought a ticket to Mexico City and flew down there and just said, let's see what happens. So if you're very tolerant of uncertainty in some aspect of your life, like travel, what do you do there that might translate over to this other part of your life where you have less uncertainty tolerance? And how could you get comfortable making some incremental, and I think the example you gave of the entrepreneur is a great fit here. So how could you be comfortable making smaller decisions? Maybe some of it is just reminding yourself, the decision was small, and if it doesn't turn out the way we thought, it won't be catastrophic. We're not going to fail and end. We will be able to recalibrate. So I think it's a combination of look at parts of your life where you do tolerate uncertainty. Can you do some of those mental behaviors, thought processes? Can you do them? Can you transfer them to another part of your life? And then just remind yourself, if we do make small decisions, we're not going to have a catastrophic failure. That's why the decision is small, and we're going to do, or we're going to proceed cautiously.
I also think this notion that we've been talking about at the beginning of theories of truth helps you understand that A, we don't know, B, we're not likely to know, and probably no one else knows either. And when you can get to say that with some degree of, here's what we do know, here's what we don't know, that theory of truth, I think, helps you accept more of the reality, and hopefully then take an action accordingly.
Well, I agree. That's why I shared over the years, and I guess, again, I'll backtrack a bit. The ideas in the book, they do come from philosophy, but I use the term, again, not original to me, they're road tested. So, and I do have a joke about myself. I might be the world's only consulting philosopher. So obviously we have a profession called consulting psychologist. I don't know how many philosophers become consultants. I'm probably not the only one, but anyway, people do think philosophy is abstract. It's metaphysical. What does it have to do with business? But theories of truth, if you understand them, I think they have a very practical function, which you just described, in helping people navigate uncertainty by acknowledging, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. And I really appreciate your last comment. Maybe nobody knows. That actually can be reassuring. There's no shame in saying, I don't know, because nobody here knows. We've got to figure it out together.
Right. I think that's the power of collaboration. It's when you can say that, I think then people are willing to jump in. And I actually think it creates greater psychological safety because quite honestly, you don't know and you're waiting for me to find out. Well, then my idea is as good as anybody's. I just think it encourages a different kind of conversation. All right. I want to shift gears one more time for a different kind of decision, a hiring or promotion decision. So we've got an opportunity. We're going to select somebody to go into that opportunity. Okay. And I find that that's the moment that is most biased, where we're not looking at information. We're often not looking at facts. We rarely look at real behaviors. I'm trying to make a prediction of somebody in a different situation, how well they're do. It's just fraught with all sorts of bias. And I find one of the things of biases that is fraught with is how comfortable am I with that person? How much do I see them like me? Therefore, I think I would succeed. Therefore, they would succeed. How would you encourage people to think about those sorts of promotion decisions in order to make better informed decisions?
Well, that's I think, a very common situation. I've noticed it myself, and especially what you said, or I see it in hiring decisions and also when people are in a position to create a team that they pick to be on their team. And very often, again, with people I've coached, the first question is, who am I going to get along with? And I'll say, is that really the best question? Because if you want to think critically, you might pick people that you know think quite differently from you. And do we all get along is going to lead to groupthink. And can we have a constructive conflict and argument is going to be better. So I see it where you do in hiring, but also building teams. And people's first thought is some version of who's like me. So uh, I, I guess part of my thought about that is to have people be more aware of intuitive judgments. And one thing that I write about in the book is just how to be cautious in your consumption of popular science and popular behavioral science. And so there actually are a few popular behavioral science books that are people have read and my clients have read, and they kind of advocate follow your intuition and go with your gut, and whatever your first impression is, you should follow that. And a couple of the authors highlight highly trained psychologists who are very specialized. And they say, well, look, this highly trained psychologist can very quickly predict the success of a marriage. So therefore, you too can quickly predict the success of an employee. And well, not so fast. That one psychologist doing that doesn't mean we all know how to do it. But to pull back more, we do all have intuitive judgments. But I think kind of a misunderstanding people get from some popular science sources is just go with your gut. And as I've become a consultant, I certainly have learned a lot of cognitive psychology in addition to the philosophy. So we do all have intuitive or gut judgments, but I stress you have to be critical of them or you have to analyze them. So I think part of what happens in these hiring decisions is people, if they're thinking, who am I going to get along with or who's like me, that's a pretty quick intuitive judgment. And I always tell people the goal is not to get rid of intuitive judgments. And I would say, I don't think you can. My understanding is they're part of how our brain functions. Your previous experience with people is going to inform your impression of the person in front of you. But be aware that you're making this intuitive judgment or hunch, and pull back and ask, is this a valid judgment? Is my previous experience with a type of person relevant here? And just be aware of the thought process, because and you know this theory, I'm sure, far better than I do, but when we're making a decision, even a hiring decision, there is this dual process. We know we're rationally deliberating, but we're still receiving intuitive judgments or previous experience. So slow that process down and be aware that your previous experience might be leading you to a biased judgment about a person. And look broadly at all of the evidence you have in front of you, if that's the right word to use, their experience. I guess another place I see people be kind of biased is, where did you go to school? And that may not always be true, but sometimes that's not going to tell you how well a person will do in a particular role at all.
Right. There's plenty of evidence to support that one as well. I find it interesting you say, like we do have gut judgments. And I don't think I want to say to people, don't listen to that gut judgment. The question is, what's driving that gut judgment? Mm-hmm. Is it comfort? Is it familiarity? Is it similarity to me? Is there evidence to back it up? And this is where I think even your theories of coherence and convergence kind of come to bear. Can I get coherent? Does everybody else have the same gut judgment based on what? Okay. And can we get converging evidence somewhere that supports and backs this up? But just that pause can make decisions a whole lot better, I think, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Just asking that question.
The pause. I agree. And sometimes your intuitive judgment is giving you valid data, but it is pausing to ask, is that previous experience giving me valid data here? And it might be the person you're interviewing gives you a negative association of one person you had to fire once. And so your intuition is, I've been down this path before, not one there again. Well, okay, let's really look at this person in front of us, though. Is the detail of their profession and career, is it really like this other person? And is that previous experience relevant? It is pausing to ask that.
That's right. I have to end. I want to do one quick story, really, really quick. So this is a UK firm deciding to make a major promotion for a guy who's in Japan. And the complaint is, one more time, we don't think he's ready yet. Okay? And then we sort of start saying, why? We don't think he's ready. Don't think he's, how it goes. That sign of gut feeling. And the basic reason for the gut feeling is he doesn't have the charisma, authenticity, executive presence, gravitas that we'd really like for somebody at this level. And they're ready to say, no, don't promote. Until one person in the room says, hold on, wait a second. He's not a native English speaker. How well would any of us do in Japanese? So before we make the judgment that he's lacking gravitas, could we actually ask his Japanese clients whether he has gravitas in that language or not? Which is exactly what we're talking about, that pausing to say what's driving the gut and where is there other coherent information that would support what we're concluding or not.
Yeah. Great way to apply the coherence theory of truths.
Great.
Is what we're saying about this person, does it fit within a broader context or not? Maybe that broader context, in this case, feedback from Japanese colleagues, disproves what we think. And what we think is not true.
And besides which, he's going to work in Japan. He's not moving to the UK at all. So, okay. All right, great. Last question, Haywood. You have a lovely reasoning test. If people wanted to know more about this reasoning test, where do they go to find out information?
Well, they could go to my website, which is just my name, www.haywoodsspangler.com, and email me directly. Or you can find me on LinkedIn and connect. And the assessment really, it's designed to show you your preference for 6 different kinds of ethical reasoning. So the assessment's really how I moved into consulting. I had taught business ethics, and I wanted to present ethical theory to people in a work context. And so that's how I developed the assessment. So it shows you your preference for these 6 types of reasoning about decisions. Again, back to where we started, particularly about gray areas or dilemmas, and which style do you prefer the most, but which style do you prefer the least that you might develop. And part of the theory I have, and I've used the assessment with boards, corporate attorneys, all kinds of groups. My argument is to really make a complex decision effectively, you have to pay attention to all 6 kinds of reasoning. So it does balance consequences with respect for duties, balancing the good of the group and the good of the individual, using cost-benefit analysis, but weighing that against building trust and fidelity. So for a truly complex decision, using all 6 styles, I think is the key. And that's how I've used it to facilitate for pretty much the 15 years of my practice. So just contact me directly through my website or through LinkedIn.
I love it. I can imagine also if somebody is getting feedback that they need to be, quote, more strategic, looking at these kinds of reasoning styles and rounding out your portfolio would probably help in your strategic thinking. That's not what you started with, Haywood, but as you went through the 6 styles, that's where my brain went. So very good.
Good. Great.
All right. My guest today, Haywood Spangler. You can find him on his website at haywoodspangler.com or on LinkedIn. The book we're talking about, Reasoning for Business, The Inquirer's Guide to Decision Making. What a great conversation. I love it. Teach me things I don't know.
Well, likewise, I learned a lot from you, and I think we've both got some great examples to use going forward. So I really appreciate the time and great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Haywood. I really appreciate it. If you want to watch this conversation, check out our YouTube channel at Out of the Comfort Pod. Certainly send us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. If you've got any questions, just be in touch, outofthecomfortzone.com. And we'll see you next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone.